The morning everything changed started with the sound of my coffee maker grinding to life at exactly 6:30. I had always been an early riser, but lately those quiet hours before the neighborhood stirred had become my sanctuary. Outside my kitchen window, Birch Street lay dormant under a blanket of October fog, the kind that clung to everything like wet gauze and made the whole world feel muffled and safe. I had no idea that within 12 hours that same street would become the stage for a confrontation that would split my carefully rebuilt life wide open. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was standing at my counter, watching steam curl up from my favorite mug when my phone buzzed against the granite. The screen lit up with a message from Lisa Chen, and my stomach immediately tightened. Lisa never texted me directly. As the unofficial queen of Maplewood Heights, she usually communicated through carefully worded neighborhood group messages or formal emails about upcoming events. A direct text felt personal, urgent, almost intimate in a way that made me uncomfortable. Emma, need to discuss tomorrow's charity setup. Can you stop by around 10? Thanks. No greeting, no pleasantries, just the kind of efficient communication that Lisa wielded like a scalpel. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to decline, to make up some excuse about work deadlines or family obligations. But the larger part of me, the part that had been trying so desperately to belong somewhere again after my divorce, knew I couldn't say no. Not to Lisa. Not when she held the keys to every social circle that mattered in this neighborhood. I had moved back to Maplewood Heights 8 months earlier, carrying nothing but a U-Haul full of furniture that no longer fit together and a heart that felt like it had been put through a paper shredder. The house on Birch Street had belonged to my grandmother, sitting empty for 2 years after she passed, waiting for someone in the family to need it. When my marriage to David collapsed in a spectacular display of mutual indifference and his secretary's perfume on his shirts, I needed it more than I needed my next breath. The neighborhood hadn't changed much since my childhood summers spent here. The same maple trees lined the streets, their leaves now turning the color of burnished copper. The same front porches held the same wrought iron furniture, though newer cars sat in driveways that used to host my grandmother's bridge club meetings. What I hadn't expected was how quickly I would realize that moving back meant navigating an entirely new social ecosystem, one where Lisa Chen sat firmly at the top. Lisa had lived in the corner house for 15 years, the kind of sprawling colonial that made every other home on the street look modest by comparison. She had perfectly manicured flower beds that changed with the seasons, a husband who worked long hours and rarely spoke at neighborhood gatherings, and an uncanny ability to make every conversation feel like a performance where she was both director and star. Within my first week back, she had appeared at my door with a casserole and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Welcome back to the neighborhood, Emma," she had said, standing on my front porch like she owned it. "I remember you used to visit your grandmother here, such a sweet old lady. I'm Lisa Chen, I coordinate most of our community activities." She had handed me the casserole dish still warm, and I had felt that familiar flutter of gratitude mixed with unease that would come to define our entire relationship. That was how it started. The casserole led to an invitation to the monthly book club, which led to a request to help with the annual Halloween block party, which led to my gradual absorption into Lisa's carefully orchestrated world of neighborhood politics and social hierarchies. I told myself I was grateful. After months of eating dinner alone in my Phoenix apartment, listening to the sound of David packing his belongings in the next room, the constant hum of community involvement felt like a lifeline. The truth was more complicated. Every interaction with Lisa left me feeling slightly off balance, like I was playing a game where everyone else knew the rules but me. She had a way of asking for help that felt less like a request and more like a gentle command. "Emma, you're so good with design work, could you handle the flyers for the charity drive? Emma, since you're not tied down with family obligations, would you mind taking the evening shift at the bake sale? Emma, you understand what it's like to start over. Maybe you could organize the donation collection for families in transition." Each time, I said yes. Each time, I threw myself into the task with the kind of desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to prove their worth. I designed flyers that were small works of art, stayed late to clean up after events, and donated more time and money than I could comfortably afford. I told myself this was what community looked like, what belonging felt like. I convinced myself that the tight feeling in my chest whenever Lisa smiled at me was just adjustment anxiety, the natural growing pains of building a new life. The morning of the charity event setup, I dressed carefully in jeans and a sweater that struck the right balance between approachable and put together. The annual Maplewood Heights Community Care Drive was Lisa's signature event, a weekend-long fundraiser that collected money and supplies for local families in need. It was also, as I had learned over the past 2 months of planning meetings, Lisa's opportunity to demonstrate her organizational prowess and confirm her position as the neighborhood's indispensable leader. I had volunteered to coordinate the silent auction, spending weeks reaching out to local businesses for donations and creating detailed catalogs of items and services. It was the kind of behind-the-scenes work that I was good at, the kind that let me contribute without having to navigate the complex social dynamics that seemed to govern every other aspect of the event. I had spreadsheets and confirmation emails, and carefully planned logistics. I had everything under control. The Chen house looked even more imposing in the morning light, its brick facade and perfectly edged lawn creating an impression of suburban perfection that felt.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Felt almost aggressive in its completeness. I walked up the front path, noting the elaborate fall decorations that somehow managed to look both festive and intimidating. Before I could knock, the door swung open to reveal Lisa, dressed in yoga pants and a fitted sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Emma, perfect timing," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Mark's already left for his Saturday golf game, so we can talk freely." There was something in her tone that made me pause, a sharpness that hadn't been there in our previous interactions. The house smelled like expensive candles and coffee, the kind of carefully curated domestic perfection that made me acutely aware of my own imperfections. We sat in her living room, a space that looked like it had been photographed for a home decorating magazine. Lisa settled into an armchair that positioned her slightly above me on the couch, a subtle power dynamic that I was only now beginning to recognize. She had a manila folder in her lap and a pen in her hand, the props of someone preparing to conduct business. "So," she began, opening the folder with deliberate precision, "I've been reviewing the silent auction items, and I have some concerns." She pulled out my carefully prepared catalog, and I felt my stomach drop as I saw red ink marks scattered across several pages. "Some of these donations are, well, they're not quite what we usually feature at our events." I leaned forward, trying to see what she was marking. "What do you mean? Everything has been confirmed and verified. I have emails from every business owner." Lisa's smile was patient in the way that adults are patient with children who don't understand why they can't have candy for breakfast. "Oh, I'm sure you worked very hard on this, Emma. But you have to understand, this event reflects on all of us. When people see items from, say, Joe's Auto Repair, or that little Mexican restaurant on 5th Street, it sends a certain message about our community standards." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her, trying to process what she was actually saying. "Those are local businesses, Lisa. Isn't the point to support the whole community?" "Of course," she said, her tone becoming more clipped. "But we also have to think about our image. The donors at this event are influential people. They expect a certain level of quality, a certain type of vendor. I'm sure you understand." She set the catalog aside and fixed me with a look that was somehow both sympathetic and condescending. "This is probably just a learning curve for you. You've been away from community organizing for a while." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I kept my voice level. "I've been organizing events since college, Lisa. These businesses offered genuine valuable donations. A full car detailing service, catered meals for 6 people, those aren't small contributions." Lisa sighed, the kind of theatrical exhale that suggested she was dealing with someone particularly difficult. "Emma, I think you're missing the bigger picture here. This isn't just about the monetary value. It's about perception, about maintaining the reputation we've built over years of careful cultivation. I can't have our signature event looking like a community garage sale." The casual cruelty of the comment took my breath away. I thought about Joe Martinez, who had spent 20 minutes explaining to me how he understood what it meant to struggle, how he wanted to give back to neighbors who might be facing the same challenges he had faced when he first started his business. I thought about Maria Gonzalez, who had offered to cater an entire dinner because she remembered what it was like to wonder where her family's next meal would come from. "These are good people offering meaningful help," I said, my voice finally carrying some of the anger I was feeling. "They're exactly the kind of community members this event should be celebrating." Lisa's expression shifted, and for the first time since I had known her, the polite mask slipped completely away. Emma, let me be very clear about something. This is my event. I've been running it successfully for 5 years. I brought you in to help because I thought you could handle simple tasks without supervision, but clearly I overestimated your capabilities. The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of the couch cushion, trying to maintain my balance in a conversation that had suddenly become something else entirely. Lisa, I followed every guideline you gave me. I confirmed every detail. I don't understand what's happening here. She stood up, moving to the window that overlooked her perfect front yard. What's happening is that you're questioning my judgment and my leadership, and frankly it's becoming exhausting. Do you have any idea how much work goes into maintaining community standards? How much effort it takes to keep this neighborhood the kind of place people actually want to live? I stood up too, my hands shaking slightly. I'm not questioning anything. I'm trying to understand why local business owners who were generous enough to donate to our cause are suddenly not good enough for your standards. Lisa turned around, and the look on her face was something I had never seen before. It was cold and calculating, and absolutely certain of its own righteousness. You know what your problem is, Emma. You're pathetic. You came crawling back to this neighborhood after your husband decided he didn't want you anymore, and now you're so desperate to belong somewhere that you can't see when you're in over your head. The words landed like physical blows. I felt my face burning, my throat closing up, my entire body reacting to the casual viciousness of what she had just said. The room went completely silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. You think because you lived here as a child, because your grandmother was respected in this community, that somehow gives you automatic standing here. But respect is earned, Emma. And you haven't earned anything yet, except the reputation of someone who tries too hard and still gets everything wrong. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there in her perfect living room, surrounded by her perfect decorations and her perfectly orchestrated life, feeling like I was 12 years old again and being told by the popular girls at school that I would never be one of them. Lisa seemed to take my silence as confirmation of her assessment. She walked back to her chair and sat down, smoothing her sweater with the kind of deliberate calm that made her previous outburst even more devastating. I think it would be best if we simplified your role for tomorrow's event. You can help with setup and cleanup, but I'll handle the silent auction coordination myself. I've already contacted the appropriate vendors. The appropriate vendors. The words echoed in my head as I somehow managed to find my voice. What about the businesses I've already confirmed? They're expecting to participate. Lisa waved her hand dismissively. I'll send them a polite email explaining that we've had to make some adjustments to our vendor list. They'll understand. These types of events always have last-minute changes. I watched her write something in her folder, her pen moving across the paper with quick, efficient strokes. She was already moving on, already past this conversation and focused on the next task. For her, this was just another item on her to-do list. For me, it felt like the complete dissolution of everything I had been trying to build in this community. I should go, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. Lisa looked up with a bright smile that was somehow worse than her anger had been. Of course, get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will be a big day, and I'll need everyone operating at full capacity. I walked to the front door on unsteady legs, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. Behind me, I could hear Lisa already on her phone, probably calling someone to discuss the vendor changes, already erasing my work as if it had never existed. The cool October air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I realized I was crying. Not the dramatic, cathartic crying of movie scenes, but the quiet, shameful tears of someone who has just been reminded of exactly where they stand in the world. I walked slowly back to my house, each step feeling like an acknowledgement of my own insignificance. Inside my kitchen, I sat at the small table where I had eaten breakfast just a few hours earlier, when the day had still held possibility, and my place in the community had still felt secure. The catalog I had worked on for weeks was still open on my laptop screen, filled with the names and photos of business owners who had trusted me to represent them fairly. People who were now going to receive Lisa's polite email explaining why they weren't quite good enough for Maplewood Heights standards. I closed the laptop and put my head in my hands, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. It wasn't just about the event or the vendors or even Lisa's cruel words. It was about the realization that I had spent 8 months desperately trying to earn approval from someone who had never seen me as anything more than a convenient volunteer, someone useful enough to handle the tedious work but disposable enough to dismiss when I became inconvenient. The pathetic part, I realized, wasn't that my husband had left me, or that I had needed to start over. The pathetic part was how grateful I had been for Lisa's attention, how eagerly I had accepted her version of community and belonging. The pathetic part was that even now, sitting in my grandmother's house with tears on my cheeks, part of me was already wondering how I could fix this, how I could apologize my way back into Lisa's good graces. But another part of me, a smaller but growing part, was beginning to wonder why I wanted to. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of autumn day where the sky pressed down like a weighted blanket and made everything feel muted and sluggish. I had barely slept, my mind replaying Lisa's words on an endless loop, each repetition making them feel both more and less real. Pathetic. The word had taken up residence in my chest, a cold stone that made breathing feel deliberate and difficult. I stood in my shower longer than usual, letting the hot water run over my shoulders while I stared at the white tile walls that my grandmother had installed decades ago. Everything in this house carried her memory, from the creaky floorboard in the hallway to the way the kitchen faucet had to be turned just so to stop the dripping. She had been a woman who commanded respect without demanding it, who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and still found ways to make everyone around her feel valued and seen. I wondered what she would have thought about yesterday's conversation, about the choices I had been making since moving back to her street. The charity event was scheduled to begin at 10, which meant setup started at 8. Despite everything that had happened, despite the humiliation and the dismissal and the casual cruelty, I found myself getting dressed to go help. Not because I wanted to face Lisa again, but because backing out now felt like admitting that she had been right about me. That I was indeed too fragile for real community involvement, too inexperienced to handle adult responsibilities. I chose my clothes carefully, the way someone might choose armor. Dark jeans that fit well, a sweater that made me look competent, shoes that were comfortable enough for a day of staying, but nice enough to signal that I belonged. As I tied my hair back, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something that surprised me. My eyes looked different, clearer somehow, like someone had adjusted the focus on a camera lens. The hurt was still there, but underneath it was something harder and more purposeful. The community center parking lot was already busy when I arrived, volunteers unloading tables and boxes from their cars with the kind of efficient coordination that comes from years of practice. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors I had met at block parties and book club meetings, people who had smiled at me over casseroles and small talk, but who I was only now realizing I didn't actually know at all. Lisa's car was parked in the spot closest to the main entrance, a subtle but unmistakable claim on prime territory. She emerged from the building as I was getting my supplies from my trunk, clipboard in hand and that familiar expression of controlled authority on her face. When she saw me, she paused for just a moment, and I caught something that might have been surprise before her professional mask slid back into place. "Emma," she said, walking over with measured steps, "I'm glad you decided to come. I was worried that our conversation yesterday might have discouraged you from participating." Her tone was carefully neutral, the kind of diplomatic language that acknowledged our interaction without actually addressing what had happened. I closed my trunk with more force than necessary, the sound echoing across the parking lot. "I made a commitment to this event, Lisa. I don't break my commitments." The words came out steadier than I felt, carrying an undertone that surprised us both. She blinked, her pen clicking against her clipboard in a nervous rhythm. "Of course. Well, I've organized the setup assignments to make things run more smoothly. You'll be working with the registration table today, helping people check in and directing them to the various activity stations. Registration table. The volunteer equivalent of being sent to sit in the corner. I nodded slowly, letting her see that I understood exactly what kind of assignment this was. "And the silent auction, all taken care of," she said quickly. "I streamlined the vendor list and everything is ready to go. Much more manageable this way." She was already turning away, already moving on to the next item on her agenda, but I wasn't finished. "What did you tell the businesses I had confirmed?" The question stopped her mid-step. She turned back, and for a moment her carefully composed expression flickered. "I sent a brief email explaining that we had reached capacity and would keep them in mind for future events." Very professional, very polite. These things happen all the time in event planning. The casual dismissal of weeks of my work, of relationships I had built with people who had trusted me, hit me like a physical blow. But instead of the shame and hurt I had felt yesterday, I found myself getting angry. Really genuinely angry in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be in months. Those people offered to help because they believed in what we were doing, Lisa. They trusted me to follow through on my commitments to them. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Emma, I really don't have time to rehash this conversation. The event starts in 2 hours, and there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done. Perhaps we could discuss vendor management strategies at a later date. She turned away again, this time with finality, leaving me standing in the parking lot with my registration table supplies and a growing understanding of how thoroughly I had been maneuvered out of meaningful participation. The next few hours passed in a blur of name tags and welcome packets and cheerful directions to the various fundraising activities scattered throughout the community center. I smiled at neighbors and answered questions and made small talk about the weather, all while feeling like I was watching myself from a distance. Every interaction felt scripted, performative, like I was playing a role in someone else's production. Around noon, during a brief lull in the registration flow, I found myself standing near the entrance watching Lisa work the room. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping to chat with the mayor's wife, posing for photos with the local newspaper reporter, accepting compliments on her organizational skills with just the right amount of modest deflection. She was good at this, I had to admit. She understood the social dynamics of the event in ways that I was only beginning to recognize. But I also noticed things I hadn't seen before. The way conversations shifted when she approached, becoming more formal and less natural. The careful smiles that didn't quite reach people's eyes. The subtle ways that other volunteers deferred to her, not out of respect but out of something that looked more like wariness. I wondered how many of them had experienced their own version of yesterday's conversation, their own moments of being put carefully but firmly in their place. Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor from 3 houses down, approached the registration table with slow, deliberate steps. She had lived on Birch Street longer than anyone, having moved there as a young bride in the 1960s. Her husband had passed away 5 years earlier, but she still maintained her garden with military precision, and knew everyone's business with the thoroughness of someone who had been paying attention for decades. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp that came with 82 years of living. "Quite a production this year, isn't it?" She nodded toward the bustling activity around us, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely impressed by the spectacle. "It's certainly well organized," I replied carefully, unsure how much of the neighborhood politics Mrs. Patterson was aware of. She fixed me with a look that was sharp despite her. "Your grandmother would have had some thoughts about all this," she said quietly. "Dorothy never did like it when people got too big for their britches." The unexpected reference to my grandmother caught me off guard. Mrs. Patterson had been one of her closest friends, part of the bridge club that had met every Thursday for 20 years. If anyone understood the dynamics of this neighborhood, it would be her. She always said that real community was about lifting people up, not deciding who was worthy of being lifted. Mrs. Patterson's eyes moved across the room, taking in the careful social choreography around us. Some folks seemed to have forgotten that distinction. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. "I've been trying to figure out how things work here," I admitted. "It's been more complicated than I expected." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. "Power makes people do strange things, dear. Even small amounts of it, especially small amounts of it." She patted my hand with fingers that felt like paper but conveyed surprising warmth. "Your grandmother raised you better than to let anyone make you feel small. I hope you remember that." She moved away before I could respond, leaving me with her words echoing in my mind. Power makes people do strange things. I looked around the room with new eyes, seeing the event not as a celebration of community spirit, but as an elaborate performance of social hierarchy. Lisa at the center, managing and controlling and directing, with everyone else playing their assigned supporting roles. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If this was all performance, if these carefully maintained relationships were built on power dynamics rather than genuine connection, then what exactly had I been trying so hard to become part of? What had I been willing to sacrifice to earn my place in this particular version of community? The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors and donors, families browsing the various fundraising activities with the kind of casual generosity that suggested comfortable
Financial circumstances. I watched children navigate the game booths while their parents bid on silent auction items, the whole scene radiating the kind of wholesome community values that would photograph well for next year's promotional materials. But I also found myself noticing things that would never make it into those promotional photos. The way certain families were greeted with more enthusiasm than others. The subtle difference in attention paid to donors based on the size of their contributions. The careful positioning of volunteers to ensure that the most photogenic activities were visible from the main entrance. Around 3 o'clock, I saw a familiar figure enter the community center and felt my stomach drop. Maria Gonzalez, the restaurant owner whose catering donation had been deemed inappropriate for Lisa's standards, was walking through the main entrance with what looked like several containers of food. She spotted me at the registration table and headed over with a warm smile that made my chest tighten with guilt. "Emma," she called out, her voice bright with the kind of genuine pleasure that I was realizing had been absent from most of my interactions lately. "I brought some extra food for the volunteers. I know these events are long days and I thought people might get hungry." I stared at her, temporarily speechless. She had been cut from the vendor list, dismissed as not meeting community standards, and she had still shown up with food for the people who had rejected her contribution. The generosity of the gesture was overwhelming, and the contrast with Lisa's calculated social management was stark. "Maria, you didn't need to do this," I managed to say, aware that my voice was unsteady. "Especially after the changes to the auction list." She waved her hand dismissively. "Business is business, but community is community. Besides, your email was very nice. You explained everything clearly." She paused, studying my face with the kind of perceptiveness that comes from years of reading customers and understanding people. "You okay, honey? You look a little stressed." Her kindness was almost unbearable. I wanted to tell her the truth, to explain that I hadn't sent any email, that her donation had been rejected not for legitimate reasons, but because Lisa had decided her restaurant wasn't prestigious enough for the event. I wanted to apologize for being part of a system that had dismissed her generosity so casually. Instead, I heard myself saying, "It's been a complicated day, but thank you for bringing food. That's incredibly thoughtful." Maria nodded and headed toward the volunteer break area with her containers, stopping to chat with people along the way with the easy warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed connecting with others. I watched her go, feeling a mixture of admiration and shame that made my throat tight. The interaction crystallized something that had been building in my mind all day. This was what real community looked like. Not Lisa's carefully orchestrated social theater, but Maria's instinctive generosity. Not the performance of belonging, but the actual practice of caring for others without expecting anything in return. By 4 o'clock, the event was winding down, and I found myself helping to pack up registration materials with the kind of mechanical efficiency that comes from emotional exhaustion. The day had been a success by any measurable standard. Attendance was high, donations were generous, and Lisa's organizational skills had ensured that everything ran smoothly. But I felt hollow, like I had spent 8 hours participating in something that had nothing to do with my actual values or desires. I was loading the last of the folding chairs into my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Mark Chen approaching, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets and an expression on his face that I couldn't quite read. Lisa's husband was a quiet man who generally stayed in the background during neighborhood events, handling logistics and setup, while his wife managed the social dynamics. I realized that despite living 3 houses away from him for 8 months, I had never had a real conversation with just him. "Emma," he said, his voice hesitant in a way that suggested he was working up to something difficult. "Do you have a minute to talk?" I closed my trunk and turned to face him fully, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way he kept glancing back toward the community center entrance. "Of course, what's on your mind?" He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with whatever he wanted to say. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, like he was afraid he might lose his nerve if he went too slowly. "I heard what Lisa said to you yesterday. About you being pathetic, about your divorce, all of it." He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture that made him look older and more tired than I had ever seen him. I was in my office upstairs, and voices carry in that house. I heard the whole conversation. The admission hit me like cold water. Someone had witnessed that humiliating exchange, had heard Lisa's casual cruelty and my stammered responses. I felt my face burning with renewed shame, even as part of me was relieved that I hadn't imagined how awful the encounter had been. "Mark, you don't need to." I started, but he held up his hand. "Yes, I do need to. Because what she said was wrong, and cruel and completely out of line. And because I should have come downstairs and said something in the moment, but I didn't, and I've been feeling terrible about it ever since."
He looked directly at me for the first time since approaching, and I was surprised to see genuine distress in his eyes. Lisa gets stressed about these events, he continued, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone who had practiced making excuses. She puts a lot of pressure on herself to make everything perfect, and sometimes that pressure comes out in ways that aren't fair to other people. But that doesn't excuse what she said to you. It doesn't excuse the way she treated those business owners either. The acknowledgement of what had happened felt both validating and devastating. Having someone else confirm that Lisa's behavior had been inappropriate made me feel less crazy, but it also forced me to confront how thoroughly I had been willing to gaslight myself to maintain my place in this community. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. Mark sighed heavily, the sound carrying years of accumulated weight. "Because I've watched her do this to other people over the years, and I've always told myself it wasn't my business, that community politics were her domain and I should stay out of it. But watching it happen to you, seeing how hard you've been trying to contribute, to belong here, I couldn't just pretend I hadn't heard it." He paused, looking out across the parking lot where the last few volunteers were loading their cars and saying their goodbyes. "Lisa has good intentions, most of the time. She really does want this neighborhood to thrive, to be the kind of place people are proud to live. But somewhere along the way, that got twisted into thinking she had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't, who was worthy of inclusion and who wasn't." The honesty of his assessment was startling. I had expected defensiveness, justification, the kind of spousal loyalty that would minimize Lisa's behavior or blame it on external circumstances. Instead, he was offering me something that felt like genuine accountability. "I don't know what to do with this information, Mark," I said finally. "I don't know how to move forward in this neighborhood knowing what I know now." He nodded, understanding evident in his expression. "I'm not asking you to forgive her or to pretend it didn't happen. I'm not even asking you to give her another chance. I just wanted you to know that not everyone thinks her behavior was acceptable, that you weren't wrong to be hurt by it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Lisa's voice calling Mark's name from across the parking lot. We both turned to see her approaching with quick, purposeful steps, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something sharper as she took in the scene of her husband talking privately with me. "There you are," she said when she reached us, her tone bright but with an undercurrent I was learning to recognize. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to get these last few donation checks to the bank before they close." Mark straightened, and I watched him visibly transform back into the quiet, accommodating husband I had observed at neighborhood gatherings. "Of course, I was just thanking Emma for all her help today." Lisa's smile was perfect and meaningless. "Yes, Emma did a wonderful job with registration. Very thorough." She turned to me with that familiar expression of polite dismissal. "Thank you so much for your contribution today. I know these events can be overwhelming for people who aren't used to this level of organization." The casual condescension was so familiar now that it almost felt comfortable, like slipping on an old sweater that no longer fit properly. But instead of the automatic deference I had been practicing for months, I found myself responding with something that surprised all three of us. "Actually, Lisa, I found today quite educational. It's amazing what you can learn about a community when you pay attention to how people treat each other." The words hung in the air between us, polite enough to avoid direct confrontation, but pointed enough to make their meaning clear. Lisa's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing her face before settling back into practiced control. "Well," she said after a moment, "that stretched just a beat too long. I'm glad you found the experience valuable. Community involvement is certainly a learning process." Mark was looking between us with obvious discomfort, clearly recognizing the subtext of our exchange even if he wasn't sure exactly what was happening. "We should probably get going," he said quietly, placing a gentle hand on Lisa's elbow. As they walked away, I heard Lisa's voice, carefully modulated but carrying in the still evening air. "What were you two talking about? You seemed very serious." Mark's response was too quiet for me to hear, but I saw Lisa's posture stiffen slightly as they reached their car. She glanced back at me once before getting into the passenger seat, and for just a moment, the social mask slipped enough for me to see something that looked almost like uncertainty underneath. I drove home through the gathering dusk, my mind processing the day's events with a clarity that felt both new and familiar. The anger I had been suppressing all day was still there, but it was clean now, purposeful rather than chaotic. I wasn't angry at myself anymore for failing to navigate Lisa's expectations successfully.
I was angry at the expectations themselves, at the whole system of social gatekeeping that I had been so eager to join. Back in my grandmother's house, I sat at the kitchen table where I had eaten breakfast that morning, when the day had still held the possibility of redemption and belonging. The light was different now, golden and slanted through the windows in a way that made everything look softer and more forgiving. I thought about Mrs. Patterson's words about power and its effects on people. I thought about Maria's kindness in bringing food despite being rejected. I thought about Mark's admission and the weight of years that had been evident in his voice. Most of all, I thought about my grandmother, who had commanded respect in this neighborhood without ever making anyone feel small, who had built community through inclusion rather than exclusion. For the first time since moving back to Birch Street, I began to wonder if the problem wasn't that I didn't understand how this community worked. Maybe the problem was that I understood it perfectly, and I didn't like what I saw. The realization was both liberating and lonely. If I stepped away from Lisa's version of community involvement, what would replace it? If I stopped trying to earn approval from people whose approval required me to compromise my values, who would I become in this neighborhood? But as I sat in the gathering darkness of my grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated memories of someone who had lived with integrity and kindness, I began to think that maybe loneliness was preferable to the alternative. Maybe being pathetic meant being willing to accept treatment that diminished my worth. Maybe strength meant choosing solitude over compromise. The phone on my counter buzzed with a text message from Sophia, my best friend who lived across town and had been watching my neighborhood integration efforts with growing concern. "How did the charity thing go today? You've been so stressed about it lately." I stared at the message for a long time, considering how to respond. For months I had been editing my experiences for public consumption, emphasizing the positive aspects of my new community involvement, and downplaying the moments of discomfort and doubt. I had been so invested in the narrative of my successful fresh start, that I had ignored the growing evidence that the foundation was built on sand. Instead of my usual carefully optimistic update, I found myself typing the truth. It was enlightening. "I think I've been trying to fit into something that doesn't actually fit me." Her response came quickly. "Want to talk about it? I can bring wine and terrible advice." The offer made me smile for the first time all day. Real friendship, I realized, was people showing up without being asked, offering support without conditions, creating space for authenticity rather than performance. It was everything that my neighborhood relationships were not. Rain check on tonight, but yes, I think I have some figuring out to do. Take all the time you need. Just remember that you're allowed to want something different than what you thought you wanted. I set the phone down and looked around the kitchen that had sheltered 3 generations of women who had faced their own challenges and disappointments and moments of reckoning. The house felt different now, not like a refuge from my failures but like a foundation for whatever came next. Outside, Birch Street was settling into its evening rhythm, porch lights coming on, and families gathering for dinner and all the quiet domestic rituals that created the illusion of perfect suburban harmony. But I was beginning to understand that harmony built on exclusion and hierarchy wasn't really harmony at all. It was just a prettier version of the same power struggles that existed everywhere else. The question now was what I was going to do with that understanding. The decision came to me while I was washing dishes 3 days later, my hands moving through the warm soapy water with the kind of mechanical rhythm that leaves the mind free to wander. Outside the kitchen window, October was deepening into November, the last stubborn leaves clinging to branches that would soon be bare. I had been replaying Mark's conversation in the parking lot, turning his words over like smooth stones in my pocket, examining them from every angle. What struck me most wasn't his apology, though that had meant more than I could adequately express. It was his admission that this pattern had happened before, that other people had been on the receiving end of Lisa's calculated cruelty, and that he had watched it happen without intervention. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, not just because of what it revealed about him, but because of what it revealed about the community I had been so desperate to join. I dried my hands on the faded dish towel that had belonged to my grandmother, soft from years of washing and use, and made a choice that surprised me with its clarity. I was going to contact the business owners who had been cut from the auction, not to organize some kind of alternative event, or to create drama, but simply to apologize, to acknowledge that they had been treated poorly, and that I bore responsibility for my part in it. The list was still on my laptop, complete with contact information and notes about each business owner's enthusiasm for participating. Looking at it now felt like examining evidence of my own complicity. I had collected these commitments, built these relationships, made these promises, and then allowed someone else to dismiss them with the casual indifference of someone discarding junk mail. I started with Joe Martinez, from the auto repair shop. His phone rang 4 times before his gravelly voice answered, background noise suggesting he was in the middle of working on someone's car. Joe, this is Emma Rodriguez. I organized the silent auction for the Maplewood Heights charity event. I paused, suddenly uncertain about how to explain what I was calling about. Oh hey Emma, yeah, I got that email about the vendor changes. No big deal, these things happen. His tone was genuinely unconcerned, which somehow made what I had to say harder rather than easier. Actually Joe, I wanted to call because I don't think what happened was right. Your donation was generous and valuable, and you were excluded for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of your contribution. The words felt clumsy in my mouth, inadequate for what I was trying to convey. There was a moment of silence, the sound of tools being set down. What do you mean? I took a breath and told him the truth. About Lisa's concerns regarding community standards, and appropriate vendors, and the careful language that had been used to dismiss businesses like his. About my failure to challenge those decisions in the moment, and my regret about how the situation had been handled. When I finished, Joe was quiet for a long time. Finally he cleared his throat. Well, I appreciate you calling to tell me that. Can't say I'm surprised exactly. My shop's been here for 12 years, and there's definitely people in this neighborhood who see me as the guy who fixes their cars, not the guy who belongs at their charity dinners. The matter-of-fact way he said it hit me harder than anger would have. He had recognized the social dynamics at play long before I had probably anticipated this outcome, even as he made his generous offer to participate. My call wasn't revealing anything new to him. It was just confirming what he had already understood about how certain people viewed his place in the community. I'm sorry, Joe, you deserved better treatment than that. Thanks for saying so. And hey, if you ever want to organize something that's actually about helping people instead of making the organizers look good, you know where to find me. The conversation with Maria Gonzalez was more difficult. She answered her restaurant phone in the middle of what sounded like a busy dinner rush, her voice harried but still warm. When I explained why I was calling, the background noise seemed to fade as she stepped away from the kitchen chaos. Emma, honey, you don't need to apologize for other people's decisions. Her kindness was almost unbearable. I've been running a business in this area for 8 years. I know how these things work, but I do need to apologize for my part in it. I should have pushed back when your donation was dismissed. I should have stood up for the commitments I had made. Maria was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the distant sounds of orders being called and plates clinking. You know what I think? I think you're learning something important about the difference between being part of a community and being used by one. That's not an easy lesson, but it's a valuable one. Her insight was so precise, so clearly articulated, that I felt tears prick at my eye. This woman, who had been deemed not quite suitable for Lisa's carefully curated event, understood more about genuine community than I had after months of trying to navigate the social hierarchies of Maplewood Heights. I brought food to the event anyway, she continued, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Figured the volunteers deserved to eat something decent, regardless of who was making the organizational decisions. I remembered seeing her that day, moving through the community center with easy grace, offering food and conversation without any trace of resentment or bitterness. Her generosity in the face of rejection had been remarkable, and I told her so. That's just how my mama raised me, she said simply. You take care of people when you can, and you don't keep score about who takes care of you back. Makes life a lot simpler. The simplicity she described felt revolutionary, after months of navigating the complex social calculations that seemed to govern every interaction in my neighborhood. The idea of giving without expectation, of participating without performing, of belonging without auditioning for approval. By the time I finished calling all 6 businesses that had been cut from the auction, I felt emotionally drained, but somehow cleaner, like I had washed off a layer of grime I hadn't realized I was carrying. Each conversation had been different, but they had all shared a common thread of dignity and grace that stood in sharp contrast to the petty gatekeeping I had witnessed at the charity event. That evening, I found myself sitting on my front porch, despite the November chill, wrapped in one of my grandmother's quilts, and watching the street settle into darkness. The porch light cast a small circle of warmth, beyond which the neighborhood stretched out in its usual tableau of domestic tranquility. But I was beginning to see the shadows between the streetlights, the spaces where the carefully maintained image didn't quite align with reality. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her house across the street, moving slowly down her front walk to retrieve her mail. She waved when she saw me, then surprised me by crossing the street with careful but determined steps. "Evening, dear," she said, settling into the wicker chair next to mine with a slight grunt of effort. "Beautiful night for sitting outside and thinking deep thoughts." I smiled at her perceptiveness. "Is it that obvious? You've got the same look your grandmother used to get when she was working through something complicated." Dorothy was a deep thinker, that one. Never made a decision without considering all the angles. Mrs. Patterson pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Course, sometimes all that thinking could tie her up in knots, when what she really needed was to trust her gut. The comparison to my grandmother was both comforting and challenging. I had always thought of her as someone who had life figured out, who moved through the world with confidence and clarity. The idea that she had struggled with difficult decisions, that she had needed to work through complicated feelings, made her feel more human, and somehow more accessible. "I've been thinking about community," I said, the words coming out before I had fully decided to share them. "About what it means to belong somewhere, and what it costs." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. "Ah yes, the eternal question. Your grandmother and I used to talk about that quite a bit, especially toward the end when she was watching how the neighborhood was changing." She gestured toward Lisa's house, its perfect landscaping visible even in the dim light. New kind of leadership emerging, different ideas about how things should be done. Did she ever talk about Lisa specifically? Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Dorothy believed that real leadership was about making space for people, not deciding who deserved to take up space. She worried about what would happen to this neighborhood if it became the kind of place where only certain types of people felt welcome. The insight felt like a gift, a connection to my grandmother's wisdom that I hadn't expected to find. "I think I've been trying so hard to fit in that I forgot to ask whether this was actually where I wanted to fit." That's the thing about belonging, honey. It should feel like coming home, not like passing an audition. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, using the chair arm for support. "Your grandmother knew you'd figure that out eventually. She always said you had too much sense to settle for anything less than authentic." After she left, I stayed on the porch for another hour, wrapped in the quilt and my grandmother's remembered wisdom. The street was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional dog bark. In houses up and down the block, families were settling into their evening routines, children being tucked into bed, dishes being washed, television shows being watched, all the ordinary rituals of domestic life that I had been so eager to become part of. But I was beginning to understand that community wasn't about participating in other people's rituals. It was about finding the people whose values aligned with yours, whose version of caring looked like care you could recognize and reciprocate. It was about choosing quality over quantity, authenticity over acceptance. The next morning brought an unexpected test of my new perspective. I was in my backyard raking leaves when I heard Lisa's voice from the driveway next door, talking to someone on her phone in the bright animated tone she used for important conversations. "The fundraiser was absolutely wonderful," she was saying. "We exceeded our goal by 30%, which I think speaks to the power of careful organization and community engagement." I kept raking, but I couldn't help overhearing, as she continued her conversation, clearly speaking to someone from the local newspaper or possibly a community organization newsletter. "The key is maintaining high standards," she continued. "We're very selective about our vendor partnerships, because we want to ensure that every aspect of the event reflects the values and quality that our community is known for." The casual rewriting of what had happened made my hands tighten on the rake handle. The businesses that had been excluded weren't being portrayed as worthy community members who had been treated poorly, but as inferior options that had been appropriately screened out by Lisa's superior judgment. I found myself walking toward the fence that separated our yards, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and something that felt like moral obligation. Lisa noticed my approach and wrapped up her phone conversation quickly, turning toward me with that familiar bright smile. "Emma, good morning. I was just talking to the community newsletter about the success of our charity event. Such a wonderful turnout, don't you think?" The casual inclusion of me in the hour felt particularly galling given how thoroughly I had been marginalized from any meaningful participation. But instead of the automatic agreement I might have offered a week ago, I found myself responding with deliberate neutrality. "It certainly seemed well attended," I said, continuing to rake leaves near the fence line. Lisa's smile faltered slightly at my tone, but she pressed on. "I was thinking we should start planning for the winter coat drive next month. It's always such an important initiative and I know you'd be interested in helping again." The assumption that I would automatically volunteer for another one of her projects
that my participation could be taken for granted despite everything that had happened was so characteristic that I almost laughed. Instead, I stopped raking and looked at her directly. Actually, Lisa, I think I'm going to step back from neighborhood event organizing for a while. I want to focus my volunteer time in other directions. The response was clearly not what she had expected. Her eyes narrowed slightly, calculation visible behind the maintained smile. Well, that's too bad. I hope our little disagreement about vendor selection hasn't discouraged you from community involvement entirely. These kinds of organizational decisions can seem harsh when you're not used to event management. The patronizing explanation, the reduction of what had happened to a little disagreement, the implication that my response was based on inexperience rather than principle, crystallized every frustration I had been carrying for weeks. But instead of the defensive reaction she was probably expecting, I felt calm settle over me like cool water. It's not about the vendor selection, Lisa. It's about the values behind those selections. I don't think we share the same vision of what community should look like. For the first time since I had known her, Lisa looked genuinely uncertain. The social script she usually operated from didn't seem to have a response for direct confrontation delivered without anger or apology. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," she said finally, her voice losing some of its polished confidence. "I think you know exactly what I mean." I resumed raking, letting the conversation end on my terms rather than hers. I could feel her watching me for another moment before she turned and walked back toward her house, her steps quicker and less measured than usual. The interaction left me feeling energized rather than drained, like I had finally said something true, instead of something calculated to maintain peace. That afternoon, I made another decision that surprised me with its clarity. I drove to Maria's restaurant, a small but bustling place in a strip mall about 10 minutes from the neighborhood. The lunch rush was winding down, and Maria emerged from the kitchen when she saw me, wiping her hands on her apron and greeting me with genuine warmth. "Emma, what brings you by? Please tell me you're here to try our new autumn menu." The restaurant was cozy and welcoming, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together and walls covered with family photos and community event flyers. It felt lived in and authentic in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the carefully curated perfection I had been trying to integrate myself into. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about organizing something," I said. "Not a big formal event, just a small neighborhood gathering. Something focused on actually bringing people together rather than raising money or maintaining image." Maria's eyes lit up with interest. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet. Maybe a potluck dinner, or a book club, or just a monthly coffee gathering. Something where people can connect without having to audition for approval or worry about whether they're impressive enough to participate." "I love that idea," Maria said immediately. "I've been in this community for years, but I've always felt like there was an invisible wall around certain social circles. It would be wonderful to create something more inclusive." We spent the next hour brainstorming possibilities, and I found myself energized by the conversation in a way I hadn't experienced during months of neighborhood committee meetings. Maria had insights about community organizing that came from genuine care for people rather than desire for social control. She knew families who had been living in the area for years, but who never seemed to be included in the established social networks. "The thing is," she said as we discussed potential participants, "there are a lot of good people around here who just don't fit into the existing social structure. Single parents who don't have time for elaborate volunteer commitments. Older folks who feel left behind by the neighborhood's changing demographics. Newcomers who can't figure out how to break into the established circles." Her description painted a picture of a shadow community that existed parallel to Lisa's carefully managed social hierarchy. People who lived in the same area, shopped at the same stores, sent their children to the same schools, but who remained invisible to the organized community events that were supposed to represent neighborhood unity. "What if we started with something simple?" I suggested. "A monthly breakfast at the community center, just coffee and pastries and conversation. No agenda, no fundraising, no organizational structure, just people getting to know each other." Maria nodded enthusiastically. "I could provide pastries from the restaurant, and I know Mrs. Kim from the dry cleaning shop has been looking for ways to connect with neighbors. She speaks limited English, but she's one of the kindest people I've ever met." The conversation continued as we outlined a vision for genuine community building that felt revolutionary in its simplicity.
No committees, no hierarchies, no gatekeepers deciding who was worthy of participation. Just open doors, and honest conversations, and the radical idea that everyone who lived in the neighborhood had something valuable to contribute. As I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not the anxious hope of someone trying to earn approval, but the quiet satisfaction of someone acting in alignment with their values. The difference was profound and clarifying. That evening, I called my brother Jake, who lived across town but who had been watching my neighborhood integration efforts with growing skepticism. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the easy warmth that came from unconditional familial love. "Hey sis, how's suburban life treating you?" "It's been educational," I said, settling into my grandmother's old armchair with the phone cradled against my shoulder. "I think I've been learning some things about myself that I wasn't expecting to learn." Good educational, or bad educational? I considered the question, thinking about everything that had happened over the past week. The humiliation of Lisa's confrontation, the clarity of Mark's apology, the wisdom of Mrs. Patterson's perspective, the generosity of the business owners I had called, the excitement of planning something authentic with Maria. Both, I think, painful but necessary. Jake was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the sound of his television in the background, some sports commentary that he muted before responding. "You know, when you first moved back there, I worried that you were trying to recreate something that had never really existed in the first place. Like you were looking for the perfect childhood neighborhood that exists more in memory than reality." His insight was uncomfortably accurate. I had been trying to recapture something, to find a version of community that would heal the wounds left by my failed marriage and disrupted life. But I had been looking for it in the wrong places, trying to join something that required me to diminish parts of myself rather than building something that celebrated who I actually was. "I think you're right," I admitted. I was so focused on fitting in that I forgot to ask whether I actually wanted to be part of what I was trying to fit into. "So what's next?" The question felt both daunting and exciting. For months my social calendar had been dictated by Lisa's event schedule and committee meetings, and the carefully orchestrated activities that made up the official social life of Maplewood Heights. The idea of creating my own version of community involvement, of following my own instincts about what mattered, felt both liberating and terrifying. "I'm going to try building something instead of joining something," I said. "See if I can create the kind of community I actually want to be part of." "That sounds like the Emma I remember," Jake said, warmth evident in his voice. "The one who used to organize neighborhood cleanup days when we were kids because she couldn't stand seeing the playground covered in litter." The memory made me smile. I had forgotten about those childhood initiatives, the way I had simply identified problems and worked to solve them without worrying about whether I had permission or authority, or the right social connections. Somewhere along the way, I had lost that instinctive confidence in my own judgment and my own values. "Maybe it's time to remember how to do that again," I said. After we hung up, I sat in the armchair for a long time, watching the street outside my window, and thinking about the different ways people could choose to move through the world. Lisa's way, with its careful management and social gatekeeping and constant performance of superiority. Or Maria's way, with its open generosity and instinctive inclusion and genuine care for others' well-being. I thought about my grandmother, who had somehow managed to be respected and loved in this neighborhood without ever making anyone else feel small or excluded. Who had built community through addition rather than subtraction, through lifting people up rather than determining who deserved to be lifted. For the first time since moving back to Birch Street, I felt like I knew which path I wanted to follow. Not the one that led to acceptance in circles that required me to compromise my values, but the one that led to creating circles where those values could flourish. The decision felt both simple and revolutionary. Instead of trying to earn my place in someone else's version of community, I was going to build my own. The first meeting happened on a Tuesday morning, in early December, cold enough that breath formed small clouds in the community center parking lot, but not so cold that people stayed home. I had reserved the smallest room available, expecting maybe 5 or 6 people to show up for what I was calling simply coffee and connection. No agenda, no fundraising goals, no committees to join. Just an invitation to neighbors who wanted to meet each other without the usual social choreography. I arrived early with supplies donated by Maria, her restaurant's signature pastries filling the air with the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread.
Mrs. Patterson was already waiting by the entrance, bundled in a wool coat that had probably been elegant 30 years ago, and carrying a thermos that she announced contained real coffee, not that weak stuff they usually serve at these places. She asked, studying my face with the perceptiveness that came from 8 decades of reading people. Terrified, I admitted, unlocking the door to the small meeting room. What if nobody comes? What if this was a terrible idea? Mrs. Patterson chuckled, settling into one of the folding chairs with deliberate care. Honey, I've lived through enough community initiatives to know the difference between something people actually want and something they think they're supposed to want. Trust me, people want this. By 9:30, 16 people had gathered around the scattered tables, a mix of faces I recognized, and others I was meeting for the first time. Maria had brought Mrs. Kim from the dry cleaning shop, who spoke softly but whose smile needed no translation. A young father named David had showed up with his toddler, explaining that his wife was at work, and he was always looking for adult conversation during the long days of solo parenting. An elderly man named Frank, who lived alone in the apartment complex at the edge of the neighborhood, had walked 4 blocks to join us. What struck me most was the immediate ease of the conversation. Without formal presentations or organizational structure, people began talking to each other with the natural curiosity that comes from genuine interest rather than social obligation. Mrs. Kim showed photos of her grandchildren on her phone, while David's daughter colored quietly at a nearby table. Frank shared stories about the neighborhood's history, having lived there longer than anyone except Mrs. Patterson. I found myself moving between conversations not as a facilitator or organizer, but simply as another neighbor, another person interested in connection. The role felt more natural than anything I had experienced during months of committee meetings and event planning sessions. Around 10:15, I noticed a commotion near the entrance and looked up to see Lisa Chen standing in the doorway, scanning the room with an expression that shifted rapidly from curiosity to something sharper. She was dressed for the weather but also for impact, her coat and accessories clearly chosen to make an impression. Several conversations paused as people noticed her arrival. "Emma," she said, approaching with the kind of determined smile that suggested she had prepared for this encounter. "I heard through the grapevine that you were organizing something here this morning. How wonderful that you're getting involved in community building again." The casual appropriation of my initiative, the suggestion that this gathering was somehow an extension of her broader organizational vision, made several people around us shift uncomfortably. Maria, who had been deep in conversation with Frank about restaurant recommendations, looked up with obvious wariness. "This isn't really organized," I said carefully, aware that everyone was listening. "It's just neighbors getting together for coffee and conversation." Lisa's laugh was bright and dismissive. "Oh, don't be so modest. Community organizing takes real skill, real vision. I'm sure people appreciate having someone with experience guiding these kinds of interactions." She gestured around the room, as if she were surveying her domain. The condescension was so familiar that I almost fell back into my old pattern of uncomfortable accommodation. But something about the genuine warmth I had been experiencing for the past hour, the authentic connections I had watched form between people who had never been given space to meet each other properly, made Lisa's performance feel particularly jarring. "Actually, Lisa, I think people are doing just fine connecting on their own. That was kind of the whole point." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course. Though I do think there's value in having some structure, some leadership to help guide conversations in productive directions. Otherwise these things can become a bit, well, chaotic. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat from her corner table, a sound that somehow commanded attention from everyone in the room. "Seems to me that chaos might be exactly what we need more of around here. Bit too much structure lately, if you ask me." The comment hung in the air, diplomatic enough to avoid direct confrontation, but pointed enough that its meaning was unmistakable. Lisa's expression flickered with uncertainty, as she tried to calculate how to respond to criticism from someone whose neighborhood standing was unassailable. "Well," she said after a moment, "I certainly wouldn't want to interrupt anything. I just wanted to stop by and see how things were going. Perhaps we could coordinate our community outreach efforts going forward. I'd hate for us to duplicate services or confuse residents about which events are officially sanctioned." The phrase "officially sanctioned" landed like a small bomb in the room.
The implication that this gathering somehow needed her approval, that community connection required official oversight, was so presumptuous that several people visibly bristled. David, the young father, looked up from where he was helping his daughter with her coloring. Officially sanctioned by who? I thought this was just neighbors getting together. Lisa's laugh was strained now, the social script she usually operated from failing to provide appropriate responses for a room full of people who weren't following their assigned roles. Well, of course, anyone can organize informal gatherings. I just meant that for larger community initiatives, for things that represent the neighborhood officially, there are established processes. Nobody said anything about representing the neighborhood officially. Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from genuine confidence rather than manufactured position. We're just people who live near each other, getting to know each other better. The simplicity of Maria's statement highlighted the absurdity of Lisa's attempts to claim jurisdiction over casual social interaction. Around the room, I could see people beginning to understand that this exchange was about more than event coordination. It was about power, about who got to decide how community happened, and who was allowed to participate without permission. Lisa seemed to realize that she was losing control of the narrative. Her expression hardened slightly as she turned back to me. Emma, I think we should discuss this privately. There might be some misunderstandings about community protocols that we could clear up. The suggestion that I needed private instruction about proper community behavior, that my initiative was based on misunderstanding rather than intentional choice, was so patronizing that I felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger, exactly, but absolute clarity about what was happening, and what my response needed to be. I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Lisa. This gathering is exactly what it appears to be. Neighbors meeting each other without agenda or oversight. That's not something that needs to be coordinated with anyone. The directness of my response seemed to catch her off guard. For months she had been accustomed to my deference, my eagerness to accommodate her preferences and incorporate her feedback. The woman standing in front of her now was not the same person who had absorbed criticism about vendor selection without pushback. I see, she said, her voice taking on the clipped tone I recognized from our confrontation about the charity auction. Well, I hope you realize that informal gatherings like this can sometimes create confusion about neighborhood representation. People might get the wrong impression about what kinds of activities have community support. The threat was delicately delivered, but unmistakable. Lisa was suggesting that my gathering could somehow damage the neighborhood's reputation, that my version of community building was potentially harmful to the established social order. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, using her cane for support but moving with deliberate purpose. At 82, she commanded respect through sheer longevity and the accumulated wisdom of someone who had watched neighborhood politics evolve for decades. Lisa dear, she said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that could not be argued with. I think you might be overthinking this. Dorothy Rodriguez used to host coffee mornings in her kitchen every month for 20 years. Nobody ever worried about official representation then. Sometimes neighbors just want to talk to each other without all the fuss. The invocation of my grandmother's name, and her informal community building, created a historical precedent that Lisa could not easily dismiss. More importantly, Mrs. Patterson's support provided legitimacy that transcended the social hierarchies. Lisa usually navigated so skillfully. Of course, Lisa said, forced into a corner by the elder's gentle but firm intervention, I wouldn't want to suggest that informal socializing is inappropriate. I just think it's important to consider the bigger picture, the way individual actions reflect on the community as a whole. Whose version of the community? The question came from Frank, the elderly man from the apartment complex, who had been quietly listening to the entire exchange. Because from where I sit, this looks like the most community I've seen in this neighborhood in years. His comment drew nods from around the room, people who had been watching the power struggle with growing clarity about what was really at stake. Lisa found herself facing not just individual resistance, but something approaching group consensus that her intervention was unwelcome. The shift in dynamics was visible on her face, the realization that her usual strategies were not working in this context, with these people, under these circumstances. She had walked into the room, expecting to assert control over another community initiative, but had instead encountered organized resistance to her vision of how neighborhood interaction should be managed. Well, she said, after a moment of calculation, I certainly don't want to overstay my welcome. I hope everyone enjoys their coffee. The words were polite, but the subtext was clear. This was not over. As she turned to leave, Mark Chen appeared in the doorway, clearly looking for his wife. The timing was particularly awkward, arriving just as Lisa was making her exit from what had obviously been an unsuccessful attempt at social control. "Oh, there you are," he said, glancing around the room with obvious confusion about what he had walked into. "Ready to go?" Lisa moved toward him quickly, eager to escape what had become an uncomfortable situation, but as they reached the doorway, Mark paused and turned back toward the room, his eyes finding mine across the space. "This looks nice," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "Good to see neighbors getting together like this." The simple comment, offered without calculation or agenda, highlighted everything that had been missing from Lisa's intervention. Mark's approval came from authentic appreciation for community connection, not from desire to manage or control it. After they left, the room remained quiet for a moment, people processing what they had witnessed. The confrontation had been subtle but decisive, a clash between different visions of how community should work that had ended with clear victory for the more inclusive approach. "Well," said David, breaking the silence, "that was interesting." Several people laughed, the tension dissolving into the kind of shared understanding that comes from having witnessed something significant together. The attempted disruption had actually strengthened the bonds between the people who had chosen to be there, creating a common experience of resistance to social gatekeeping. Maria moved to refill the coffee urn, her movements calm and purposeful. "Anyone want more coffee? These pastries aren't going to eat themselves." The invitation to continue, to refuse to let the interruption end their gathering, was exactly what the room needed. Conversations resumed with renewed energy, people now bonded not just by their desire for connection, but by their shared experience of defending that desire against external judgment. Mrs. Patterson settled back into her chair with obvious satisfaction. "Your grandmother would have handled that exactly the same way," she told me quietly. Dorothy never did back down when she knew she was right. The comparison to my grandmother felt like a benediction, a connection to the kind of community leader I had always admired, but never thought I could become. Not the kind who controlled and managed and decided who belonged, but the kind who created space for people to belong on their own terms. The gathering continued for another hour, ending naturally as people needed to leave for work or other commitments. But the conclusion felt different from the formal endings of committee meetings or organized events. Instead of relief that obligations had been fulfilled, there was anticipation about the next time they would see each other. Several people approached me individually, as they prepared to leave, expressing appreciation for creating the space and asking about future meetings. Mrs. Kim, despite her limited English, managed to communicate that she would bring homemade cookies next time. Frank asked if it would be appropriate to invite other residents from his apartment complex. David wondered if weekend meetings might work better for working parents. Each conversation reinforced that what had happened in the room was exactly what people had been wanting, that the hunger for authentic community connection had been there all along, waiting for someone to create the right kind of space for it to emerge. As I packed up the remaining pastries and stacked the chairs, I reflected on how different this felt from the aftermath of Lisa's organized events. Instead of exhaustion and social anxiety, I felt energized and purposeful. Instead of wondering whether I had performed adequately, I felt confident that something genuine had been created. Maria stayed to help clean up, her presence comfortable and companionable in the way that real friendship felt. We worked in easy silence for a while before she spoke. That was exactly what this neighborhood needed,
she said, wiping down the tables with efficient movements. People who actually like each other talking because they want to, not because they're supposed to. "Do you think Lisa will try to shut this down somehow?" I asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at me since her departure. Maria paused in her cleaning, considering the question seriously. "I think Lisa is used to being the person who decides how community happens around here. But I also think what we saw today was people deciding they want something different. That's not something she can really control, no matter how much she might want to." Her confidence was reassuring, rooted in her years of experience with neighborhood dynamics and her clear-eyed understanding of power and resistance. She had seen Lisa's performance today not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as evidence that the established social order was more fragile than it appeared. "Besides," she continued, "did you see how people responded when she tried to take over? Nobody was having it. That tells you something about how ready people are for a different approach. The observation was accurate and encouraging. The gathering had revealed not just individual desire for authentic connection but collective resistance to social gatekeeping. People had been waiting for an alternative, they just hadn't known how to create one. That evening, I found myself on my front porch again, wrapped in my grandmother's quilt and watching the familiar rhythms of Birch Street settling into darkness. But the street looked different now, populated not just by houses but by people I was beginning to know as individuals rather than as participants in someone else's social theater. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on, and I could see her moving around inside, probably preparing for her evening routine of television and tea. Frank's apartment building was visible in the distance, its windows glowing with the lives of people who had been invisible to me just hours earlier. David's house was 3 blocks over, where he was probably getting his daughter ready for bed and planning tomorrow's activities. These people had always been there, living their lives and raising their children and contributing to the community in their own ways. But Lisa's version of neighborhood organization had rendered them invisible, focusing only on those who fit her specific vision of appropriate community membership. The success of the morning's gathering had shown that community was not something that needed to be managed or controlled or carefully curated. It was something that emerged naturally when people were given space to connect authentically, when barriers were removed rather than erected. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I was surprised to see Mark Chen's name on the screen. We had never exchanged numbers, but he had apparently gotten mine from the neighborhood directory. Emma, I wanted to apologize for Lisa's behavior this morning. What you're doing with the coffee gatherings is exactly what this neighborhood needs. I hope you'll continue despite any discouragement you might have received. The message was unexpected and deeply meaningful, not just because of its content but because of what it represented. Mark had witnessed his wife's attempt to control my initiative and had chosen to reach out in support rather than solidarity. It suggested that even within the Chen household, there was recognition that Lisa's approach to community management was problematic. I typed back a simple thank you, not wanting to create complications for him but appreciating his gesture of support. The fact that he had taken the risk of reaching out, knowing that his message might be discovered by Lisa, spoke to the strength of his conviction that what I was doing mattered. The next few weeks brought a series of small but significant changes to the social landscape of Maplewood Heights. The coffee gatherings continued, growing steadily as word spread through informal networks rather than official announcements. People began inviting neighbors they thought might be interested, creating organic expansion based on genuine connection rather than strategic networking. Mrs. Kim brought her promised cookies and stayed for the entire gathering, her limited English supplemented by smiles and gestures that needed no translation. Frank arrived with 3 residents from his apartment complex, quiet people who had been living on the edges of the neighborhood's social awareness for years. A single mother named Jennifer started attending with her teenage daughter, grateful for adult conversation and community support that didn't require her to pretend her life was more organized than it actually was. Each meeting revealed new layers of the community that had been hidden beneath Lisa's carefully curated version of neighborhood life. People who worked night shifts and couldn't attend evening events. Elderly residents who found large gatherings overwhelming but thrived in smaller, more intimate settings. Families who had been intimidated by the formal structure of established community organizations but flourished in environments that welcomed them as they were. The contrast with Lisa's events became increasingly apparent as the gatherings established their own rhythm and culture. Instead of performances of community spirit, these were actual expressions of it. Instead of networking opportunities disguised as social connection, these were genuine opportunities for people to know each other better. Lisa's response to the growing success of the coffee gatherings was initially indirect but increasingly pointed. She began organizing competing events, scheduling committee meetings and planning sessions that coincidentally conflicted with the Tuesday morning gatherings. She sent neighborhood-wide emails about official community initiatives that needed volunteer support, implying that other activities were somehow less legitimate or valuable. The strategy was transparent enough that people began commenting on it, recognizing the territorial nature of her response. Instead of drawing participants away from the coffee gatherings, her competitive approach actually highlighted the difference between authentic community building and social control. The confrontation that had been building for weeks finally came to a head on a cold Tuesday in January. I arrived at the community center to find Lisa already there, setting up what appeared to be a formal presentation in the room I had reserved for the coffee gathering. "Oh, Emma," she said when she saw me, her tone suggesting that my arrival was unexpected rather than entirely predictable. "I hope you don't mind, but I decided to use this morning's gathering as an opportunity to present some information about upcoming neighborhood initiatives. I thought people would appreciate having concrete ways to contribute to the community." The takeover was brazen and thoroughly planned, complete with printed handouts and a PowerPoint presentation queued up on a laptop. She had essentially hijacked the gathering, transforming it into exactly the kind of formal agenda-driven event that people had been seeking an alternative to. "Lisa, this isn't what people come here for," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "They come for conversation and connection, not presentations and volunteer recruitment." Her smile was patient and condescending. "Emma, I think you underestimate people's desire to make meaningful contributions to their community. Sometimes informal socializing needs to evolve into concrete action if it's going to have real impact." The reframing of my initiative as a preliminary step toward her version of community engagement was so presumptuous that it took my breath away. She was not just taking over the gathering, she was rewriting its entire purpose and history to serve her organizational agenda. People began arriving for the usual coffee and conversation, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion as they encountered Lisa's formal setup. Mrs. Patterson took one look at the PowerPoint presentation and the stacks of volunteer sign-up sheets and shook her head with obvious disapproval. "What's all this about?" asked David, his toddler in tow, and clearly expecting the usual relaxed atmosphere. Lisa launched into her prepared remarks before I could respond, explaining how she had developed an exciting new initiative that would channel the positive energy of the coffee gatherings into structured community service opportunities. She spoke with the kind of polished enthusiasm that made dissent seem churlish and ungrateful. But the audience was not responding as she had expected. Instead of the grateful attention she was accustomed to receiving, people were looking confused and disappointed. They had come for one thing and were being offered something entirely different, something that resembled every other community obligation they already felt pressured to fulfill. "This is really nice, Lisa," said Jennifer, the single mother. "But I was hoping for the usual coffee and chat. I don't have a lot of time for additional volunteering right now." Of course," Lisa replied smoothly, "but I think you'll find that structured volunteer opportunities can actually be more efficient than informal socializing. More impact for the time invested." The implication that the connections people had been building were less valuable than organized volunteer work was so dismissive that several people exchanged glances of disbelief. Frank, the elderly man from the apartment complex, raised his hand as if he were in a classroom. "Excuse me, but who decided that this gathering needed to evolve into something else? I thought the whole point was that it didn't have an agenda." Lisa's expression tightened slightly as she found herself facing direct questioning, rather than polite acceptance. "Well, Frank, community building is an ongoing process. Static approaches don't really serve people's long-term interests." "Whose long-term interests?" The question came from Maria, who had arrived just in time to witness Lisa's presentation. "Because it seems to me that people have been pretty clear about what their interests are, and it's not more committees and volunteer obligations." The challenge was direct and unapologetic, delivered with the kind of calm authority that comes from genuine confidence rather than manufactured position. Lisa found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify her takeover to people who had been attending the gatherings specifically to avoid exactly this kind of organizational management. "Maria, I appreciate your concern, but I think you might be underestimating people's capacity for meaningful community engagement. Sometimes what people think they want isn't actually what's best for them in the long run." The paternalistic statement hung in the air, like a confession of everything that was wrong with Lisa's approach to community leadership. She had essentially admitted that she believed she knew better than residents what they needed, that their expressed preferences were less important than her vision of appropriate community involvement. Mrs. Patterson stood up slowly, her cane tapping against the floor in a rhythm that commanded attention. "Lisa dear, I've been part of this community for longer than most people have been alive. I know the difference between community building and community managing. What we've been doing here is the first kind. What you're trying to turn it into is the second kind. And we don't want the second kind." The elder's statement was delivered with gentle firmness but absolute clarity. She was not arguing with Lisa, she was informing her of a decision that had already been made collectively. The gathering belonged to the people who attended it, not to the person who wanted to transform it into something else.
Lisa's composure finally cracked, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine frustration underneath. I'm trying to help this community reach its potential. What you're describing is just social club behavior that doesn't actually accomplish anything meaningful. And what you're describing, I said, finding my voice in the face of her condescension, is the same controlling approach that made people want an alternative in the first place. You can't accept that people might prefer authentic connection over organized productivity. The confrontation had crystallized into its essential elements. Lisa representing a vision of community based on hierarchy, efficiency, and managed outcomes. The rest of us representing a vision based on genuine connection, voluntary participation, and organic relationships. You know what, Emma? Lisa said, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. You've always been naive about how real community organizing works. These people don't need someone who enables their desire to avoid responsibility. They need leadership that challenges them to contribute meaningfully. They need space to connect authentically without being told what their connections should accomplish. I replied, my voice carrying a certainty I hadn't possessed during our previous confrontations. They need community that includes them as they are, not community that requires them to prove their worth through volunteer performance. Lisa packed up her presentation materials with sharp, angry movements, her grand initiative having failed spectacularly. Fine. But don't pretend that social hour is the same thing as community building. And don't expect people to take this seriously long-term if it doesn't evolve beyond casual conversation. She left without saying goodbye to anyone else, her departure feeling like the removal of a weight that had been pressing down on the room. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet that had followed her arrival. This was the silence of relief, of a threat having been confronted and neutralized. Well, said David, settling his daughter at a table with her coloring books, I guess we should probably make some coffee. The simple statement released the tension completely, people moving to resume their usual activities with renewed appreciation for what they had almost lost. Conversations picked up where they might have been. Pastries were shared, children were entertained, and the authentic community connection that Lisa had tried to co-opt reasserted itself with quiet strength. As I helped Maria set up the coffee service, she spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. You handled that perfectly, firm but not cruel, clear but not aggressive. That's real leadership. The compliment meant more to me than any committee appointment or event coordination role ever could have. This was leadership based on creating space for others rather than managing their choices, on facilitating connection rather than controlling outcomes. The gathering continued for its usual duration, but with an additional layer of bonding that came from having defended their chosen form of community against external pressure. People exchanged contact information more freely, made plans to see each other outside of the Tuesday meetings, and spoke with increased appreciation for what they had built together. As people prepared to leave, Mrs. Patterson approached me with something that looked like pride in her expression. Your grandmother would have been very proud of how you handled that situation today. Dorothy always said that real strength was knowing when to stand up and when to step back. You did both perfectly. The comparison to my grandmother felt like the completion of a circle that had been opening since the day I moved back to Birch Street. I had spent months trying to earn my place in someone else's version of community, only to discover that what I actually needed to do was create space for the kind of community I wanted to be part of. That afternoon, I received a phone call from Mark Chen. His voice was tired but resolved when he identified himself. Emma, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. Not just for this morning, but for everything that's happened over the past few months. I should have spoken up sooner about Lisa's behavior, not just to you but to other people she's treated poorly over the years. The admission was unexpected in its scope and sincerity. Mark, you don't need to apologize for other people's choices. Actually, I think I do. When you watch someone being treated badly and you don't say anything, you become part of the problem. I've been part of the problem for too long. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I wanted you to know that what you've created with these coffee gatherings is exactly what this neighborhood has needed for years. Real community, not the performance of community. What will this mean for you at home? I asked, genuinely concerned about the consequences he might face for supporting an initiative that Lisa clearly opposed. Mark was quiet for a moment. That's something I need to figure out. But I can't keep enabling behavior that I know is harmful just to keep peace in my own house. That's not fair to the people who get hurt, and it's not fair to Lisa either. Someone needs to tell her that this approach isn't working. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but Mark's central point was clear. He was choosing to support authentic community building over loyalty to his wife's controlling approach, even knowing that this choice would create difficulties in his personal life. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table looking out at Birch Street as afternoon shadows lengthened across the familiar landscape. The neighborhood looked the same as it had on the day I arrived 8 months earlier, but everything had changed in ways that mattered more than surface appearances. I had come back to this street seeking acceptance and belonging, willing to compromise my values and authentic self to earn my place in an established social order. What I had discovered instead was that the belonging I craved could not be earned through performance or awarded by gatekeepers. It had to be created through the patient work of building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared values. The coffee gatherings had grown into something more than social events. They had become proof that community could be inclusive rather than exclusive, organic rather than managed, authentic rather than performative. People who had been marginalized by the established social hierarchy had found space to connect and contribute. People who had been intimidated by formal volunteer obligations had discovered ways to care for their neighbors that felt natural and sustainable. Most importantly, I had learned the difference between trying to fit into someone else's vision of community and creating space for the kind of community that aligned with my actual values. The first approach required me to diminish parts of myself to meet external expectations. The second approach allowed me to contribute my authentic strengths to something larger than myself. The transformation had not been easy or comfortable. Standing up to Lisa's attempts at control had required me to access courage I wasn't sure I possessed. Choosing to prioritize authentic connection over social acceptance had meant risking isolation and judgment. But the rewards had been worth the risks. As evening settled over Maplewood Heights, I felt something I had not experienced since my marriage ended. Not just peace or contentment, but genuine excitement about the future. I had work that mattered, relationships that nourished me, and a growing understanding of my own capacity for leadership and community building. The woman who had stirred soup and answered Aunt Miriam's text message all those months ago felt like a different person entirely. She had been seeking permission to belong, approval for her contributions, validation for her worth. The woman sitting at this kitchen table no longer needed those things from external sources. She had found ways to belong that didn't require auditions, to contribute that didn't require approval, to matter that didn't require validation from people whose values she didn't share. Tomorrow there would be another Tuesday, another gathering of neighbors who had chosen authentic connection over social performance. There would be new people to welcome, new conversations to facilitate, new bonds to witness forming between people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of community space. But tonight I was content to sit in my grandmother's house on the street, where she had modeled a different kind of community leadership, surrounded by the growing understanding that I had finally found my place. Not by earning it from others, but by creating it for myself and opening it generously to anyone who wanted to share it. 3 months after that final confrontation with Lisa, I found myself standing in Maria's restaurant on a Saturday evening, surrounded by faces that had become genuinely familiar, rather than merely recognizable. The monthly potluck dinners had evolved naturally from the Tuesday coffee gatherings, growing into something that none of us had planned but all of us had needed. Tonight marked the 6th dinner, and the small dining room was filled with the kind of warm chaos that comes from real community rather than orchestrated events. Mrs. Kim had brought kimchi that made everyone's eyes water in the best possible way, while Frank regaled a table of newcomers with stories about the neighborhood's transformation over the decades. David's daughter was teaching Mrs. Patterson's great-grandson how to fold napkins into elaborate shapes, their concentration so intense that neither noticed the adults watching them with delighted smiles. Jennifer had arrived with a casserole and her teenage daughter, both of them finally looking relaxed in a way that suggested they had found their tribe. The contrast with Lisa's carefully choreographed events was impossible to ignore, though by now the comparison felt less significant than it once had. Where her gatherings had been performances of community spirit, these dinners were actual expressions of it. Where her events had required people to present their best selves, these gatherings welcomed people exactly as they were. The difference was profound and liberating, creating space for the kind of authentic relationships that I had been seeking without knowing how to name what I needed. Maria moved between tables with the easy grace of someone who understood hospitality not as performance, but as genuine care for others' comfort. She had closed the restaurant early to host tonight's dinner, transforming her business space into something that felt more like an extended family gathering. The gesture was characteristic of her approach to community, generous and inclusive without being calculated or strategic. "Emma," she called from behind the counter where she was preparing coffee for anyone who wanted it, "could you help me carry these cups out? I think people are ready for something warm." I moved through the dining room with the coffee service, stopping at each table to offer refills and check in on conversations. The ease of these interactions still surprised me sometimes, the way people had grown comfortable sharing, not just their polished successes, but their actual struggles and uncertainties. Tonight's conversations ranged from Mrs. Patterson's concerns about her aging car to Frank's excitement about his grandson's upcoming visit to Jennifer's cautious optimism about a potential job opportunity. At the corner table, a new couple was talking with David about the challenges of finding good childcare, their relief at discovering other parents who understood their situation evident in their relaxed postures. They had heard about the dinners through Mrs. Kim, who had mentioned them to another parent at her granddaughter's school pickup. The organic spread of information through authentic relationships rather than official announcements had become one of the defining characteristics of how this community operated. As I served coffee to the table where Mrs. Patterson was holding court with her usual collection of admirers, she caught my hand gently. "Sit with us for a minute, dear. You've been bustling around all evening like you're running a restaurant yourself." I settled into the empty chair beside her, grateful for the excuse to pause and simply observe what had been created in this space. The sound level in the room was comfortable rather than overwhelming.
Conversations intimate enough that people could hear each other without shouting, but animated enough to create an atmosphere of engagement and connection. "Look around this room," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, following my gaze as it moved from table to table. "Tell me what you see." It was the kind of question she specialized in, invitations to recognize truths that might otherwise remain invisible. I took my time, really studying the faces and interactions around us. I see people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. People who feel safe being themselves instead of performing versions of themselves. "And what do you see when you look at yourself in this context?" The question was more penetrating than I had expected, requiring me to examine not just what I had helped create, but who I had become in the process of creating it. The woman sitting in this chair was different from the one who had moved back to Birch Street less than a year ago. Not just more confident, though that was certainly true, but more fundamentally comfortable with her own values and vision. I see someone who stopped trying to earn approval and started creating the conditions for authentic connection, I said finally. Someone who learned the difference between belonging and fitting in. Mrs. Patterson nodded with satisfaction. "Your grandmother would have been proud to hear you say that." Dorothy always understood that real leadership was about making space for others to flourish, not about proving your own importance. The comparison to my grandmother had become less surprising over the months, but it still carried weight. I had grown up admiring her ability to command respect while making everyone around her feel valued, but I had never understood how she accomplished that balance. Now I was beginning to see that it was less about specific techniques and more about fundamental orientation toward other people's well-being. The dinner was winding down naturally as people began to clear their own dishes and help stack chairs, the kind of collaborative cleanup that happens when people feel ownership of a space rather than simply consuming services provided by others. Maria declined offers to help wash dishes, explaining that she actually enjoyed the quiet ritual of closing down the restaurant at the end of a successful evening. As people prepared to leave, they lingered in conversations that seemed reluctant to end, making tentative plans for coffee dates and shared activities that would extend their connections beyond the formal gatherings. The organic development of smaller friendships within the larger community had been one of the most rewarding aspects of what we had built together, proof that authentic relationships could grow when people were given appropriate soil and conditions. Frank approached me as I was gathering my own things, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested he had something particular on his mind. "Emma, I wanted to thank you for what you've done here. Not just the organizing, but the way you've done it. You've made space for people like me who don't usually get included in community things." The gratitude in his voice was humbling, especially coming from someone whose wisdom and life experience far exceeded my own. "Frank, you've contributed so much to these gatherings. Your stories, your perspective, your kindness to newcomers. This community wouldn't be the same without you." "Maybe not," he said with a smile, "but it wouldn't exist at all without someone being willing to start it." That took courage, especially after what happened with the other situation. He was referring to Lisa's attempts to control and ultimately sabotage the community connections I had been facilitating, though he was tactful enough not to name the conflict directly. I think I had to learn that courage isn't about not being afraid, I replied. It's about doing what matters even when you are afraid, and what mattered was creating space for people to connect authentically, regardless of who approved or disapproved. Frank nodded knowingly. That's the thing about real community. It threatens people who are invested in controlling how community happens. But it's also stronger than their attempts to control it, because it's based on what people actually want rather than what they think they're supposed to want. His observation captured something essential about the resistance we had encountered and overcome. Lisa's vision of community had required people to conform to her standards and participate in her preferred activities. Our approach simply created space for people to connect based on their own interests and values, which turned out to be far more sustainable and satisfying. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood Heights, I reflected on how different the neighborhood felt now compared to my first months back. The physical landscape was unchanged, the same houses and trees and streetlights creating the familiar suburban tableau. But my relationship to this place had been fundamentally transformed by understanding that community was something I could create rather than something I needed to be accepted into. The coffee gatherings had stabilized at around 20 regular participants, with new people joining occasionally as word continued to spread through organic networks. The monthly dinners typically drew a slightly smaller but equally engaged group, people who were ready for deeper connection and more substantial time commitments. Both activities operated without formal structure or organizational hierarchy, sustained by people's genuine appreciation for what they provided rather than by any external pressure or obligation. More importantly, the connections formed in these gatherings had begun to extend into daily life in ways that enriched the entire neighborhood. People checked on each other during illness, shared resources during emergencies, and created informal support networks that functioned more effectively than any official community services. Mrs. Kim had become the unofficial neighborhood coordinator for elderly residents who needed occasional assistance with transportation or shopping. David had organized a loose network of parents who took turns providing childcare during emergencies. Maria's restaurant had become an informal community center where people gathered for impromptu conversations and mutual support. The transformation had happened gradually enough that it felt natural rather than dramatic, but the cumulative effect was profound. Maplewood Heights had become the kind of place where people genuinely cared about their neighbors' well-being, not because they were supposed to, but because they had developed actual relationships that made caring feel natural and rewarding. Lisa's response to these developments had evolved over the months from active resistance to grudging tolerance to what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. She continued to organize her formal community events, but attendance had declined as people discovered alternatives that felt more authentic and inclusive. Her attempts to co-opt or control the organic community networks had failed repeatedly, largely because they operated through personal relationships rather than institutional structures that could be captured or redirected. Mark had eventually told me that she spent considerable time trying to understand why her approach to community organizing was losing influence, genuinely confused about why people would prefer informal gatherings to carefully planned events with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The conversation had revealed that her controlling behavior stemmed not from malice but from a fundamental misunderstanding about what people actually wanted from community involvement. She really believes that structure and leadership and organized activities are what make communities strong. Mark had explained during one of our occasional conversations. The idea that people might prefer authentic connection over managed engagement just doesn't compute for her. It's like trying to explain color to someone who's colorblind. His perspective had helped me understand Lisa's behavior with more compassion, though it hadn't changed my commitment to creating community spaces that operated on different principles. People deserve to have their preferences respected rather than managed, their authentic selves welcomed rather than improved, their contributions valued rather than evaluated for appropriateness. The realization that I had become a community leader, not through appointment or election, but through the simple act of creating space for others to flourish, still felt surreal sometimes. Leadership in this context looked nothing like what I had imagined when I first moved back to the neighborhood. It required less control and more trust, less planning and more responsiveness, less performance and more authenticity.
The skills I had developed over the months were different from those typically associated with community organizing. Instead of learning to manage people and coordinate logistics, I had learned to listen carefully and create welcoming spaces. Instead of developing expertise in fundraising and event planning, I had cultivated the ability to facilitate genuine conversation and help people feel comfortable being themselves. Most importantly, I had learned that sustainable community building required alignment between personal values and public actions. The exhaustion and anxiety I had experienced during my attempts to succeed in Lisa's version of community involvement had stemmed from the constant effort required to suppress parts of myself that didn't fit her expectations. The energy and satisfaction I derived from the community connections I had helped create came from being able to contribute my authentic strengths without compromising my core values. As I pulled into my driveway and saw the warm light spilling from my grandmother's kitchen windows, I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Not because someone else had determined that you were worthy of belonging, but because you had created belonging for yourself and others through patient work and genuine care. The house welcomed me with the familiar sense of home and the accumulated memories of 3 generations of women who had found their own ways to contribute to their communities. My grandmother's influence was visible not just in the physical space, but in the approach to community leadership that I had gradually developed, emphasizing inclusion over exclusion, authenticity over performance, and genuine care over social obligation. Tomorrow would bring another Tuesday, another opportunity for neighbors to gather for coffee and conversation without agenda or expectation. Next month would bring another potluck dinner, another chance for people to share food and stories, and the kind of unhurried time that allows real relationships to develop. These rhythms had become as natural and necessary as breathing, sustaining not just individual connections but the broader sense of community that made the neighborhood feel like home. The transformation that had begun with Lisa's cruel words in her perfect living room had led to something none of us could have anticipated. Not just personal growth or individual empowerment, but genuine community change that had made life better for everyone who participated. People who had been isolated had found connection. People who had felt judged had found acceptance. People who had been marginalized had found belonging. The pathetic woman who had absorbed criticism without pushback, who had apologized for other people's poor treatment of her, who had been grateful for scraps of conditional acceptance, no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that belonging was not something to be earned, but something to be created, not something to be granted by gatekeepers, but something to be built through authentic relationships and shared values. The journey had been difficult and uncertain, requiring me to develop courage I hadn't known I possessed, and to trust instincts I had been taught to doubt. But the destination had been worth every moment of discomfort and uncertainty. I had found my place in the world, not by fitting into someone else's vision of community, but by creating space for the kind of community that aligned with my deepest values and highest aspirations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.